Imagine for a second that you are the President of the United States. You are sitting in the Oval Office, the most powerful room on the planet. It's June 23rd, 1972. Just 6 days ago, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate building. Your campaign's fingerprints are all over this thing. A check from your finance chairman. Money that traced back to your committee to re-elect the president. You have a choice. Come clean. Fire the idiots who authorized this third-rate burglary. Take the political hit and move on. Or you can do what Nixon did. You can lie. You can cover it up. You can use the full power of the presidency to obstruct justice. And you can record yourself doing it. That's right. On that June morning, Richard Nixon sat in the Oval Office with his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, and they hatched a plan to use the CIA to shut down the FBI's investigation. And the whole thing was captured on tape. His own taping system, a system he installed, a system nobody knew about. Welcome to the story of how Richard Nixon destroyed himself, not with his crimes, but with his own paranoid need to record everything. Today we're going to dissect the most spectacular cell phone in American political history. How a secret recording system, a single stubborn prosecutor, and one devastating 18-minute conversation brought down the most powerful man in the world. Buckle up. 1. The paranoid president installs his own surveillance state. Let's rewind to 1971. Richard Nixon was riding high. He'd just pulled off the diplomatic coup of the century, opening relations with communist China. The Vietnam War was winding down. His re-election in 1972 looked like a lock. But Nixon had a problem. He was deeply, pathologically paranoid. He was obsessed with leaks. Obsessed with enemies. Obsessed with making sure history remembered him correctly. He kept an enemies list. He ordered wiretaps on journalists. He authorized break-ins to steal psychiatrists' files. And in early 1971 he decided to install a secret taping system in the Oval Office, the Executive Office Building, and even at Camp David. The goal? To create a complete historical record of his presidency. Every conversation, every decision, every backroom deal. Nixon wanted to control the narrative. He wanted future historians to have his version of events, in his own words, captured for posterity. It's almost touching, really. The pomp, this deep need to be understood, to be vindicated by history. Here's the kicker. Nixon wasn't tech-savvy. At all. He was, in Alexander Haig's words, spectacularly inept at understanding mechanical devices. He needed a system that was hands-off, automatic, foolproof. So his Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, worked with the Secret Service to install voice-activated recording equipment. No buttons to push. No tapes to change. Just walk into the room, start talking, and everything was captured on ultra-thin Sony tape running at the glacial speed of 15/16 inch per second. Only a handful of people knew the system existed. Haldeman, his assistant Lawrence Higbee, Alexander Butterfield, who managed the installation, a few Secret Service technicians from the Technical Security Division. That's it. The system was so secret that most White House staffers had no idea their conversations were being recorded. They spoke freely, they plotted, they schemed, and the tape kept rolling. The system recorded about 3,700 hours of conversation between February 1971 and July 1973. Discussions about foreign policy, the 1972 visit to China, the opening to the Soviet Union, domestic strategy, office gossip, and Watergate. So much Watergate. But think about this. Nixon voluntarily created a permanent record of his own crimes. It's like a bank robber installing security cameras in his own getaway car and forgetting they're there. The hubris is staggering. The irony is beautiful. Nixon later wrote in his memoir that he thought the existence of the tapes would never be revealed. Never. As if secrets stay secret in Washington. As if human beings are capable of keeping their mouths shut when they know something explosive. Nixon created this system to control his legacy, to make sure his version of events would be the one historians studied. Instead, he created the evidence that would destroy him. The tool he built to defend himself became the weapon his enemies would use to drive him from office. You cannot make this stuff up. 2. The smoking gun. 6 days after the crime. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. One of them, James McCord, worked for Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, which the press deliciously nicknamed Creep. The burglars were caught with bugging equipment, cameras, lockpicks, tear gas guns, and $2,300 in cash, mostly $100 bills with sequential serial numbers. At first it looked like a minor embarrassment, a third-rate burglary, as Nixon's press secretary would call it. But the FBI started investigating immediately. And they were good. And they were good. Really good. Within days they traced a $25,000 check deposited in the bank account of one of the burglars, Bernard Barker. The check was written to Kenneth Dahlberg, Nixon's finance chairman in the Midwest. The money trail led straight back to Nixon's campaign. This was the problem area. This was the thread that, if pulled, would unravel the whole thing. The FBI was also finding other connections. Money laundered through Mexico, photographs of Democratic documents, an informant who developed film for the burglars. The investigation was, in Haldeman's words, leading into some productive areas, which was exactly what they didn't want. So on June 23, 1972, 6 days after the break-in, Haldeman walked into the Oval Office with a plan. The conversation started at 10:04 a.m. and ran for 95 minutes. Buried in the middle of that conversation was the exchange that would destroy Nixon's presidency. Haldeman told Nixon that the FBI investigation was getting too close, that they were tracing the money, and it was leading to bad places. The solution? Get the CIA to tell the FBI that Watergate involved national security, that the FBI needed to stay the hell out of this, or they'd stumble into secret CIA operations. Have Deputy CIA Director Vernon Walters call FBI Acting Director Pat Gray and shut it down. It was a lie. There was no CIA operation. There was no national security angle. It was pure obstruction of justice. And Nixon agreed to it immediately. His response was a series of grunts and acknowledgements. Yeah, right. Not once did he say, wait, we can't do that. Not once did he hesitate. Here's what Haldeman said, captured word for word on tape. The way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this. This is a business here, we don't want you to go any further on it. That's not an unusual development. Nixon's response, that's it. That's the whole conversation. A few grunts, a plan to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI, and Nixon's implicit approval. The tape shows Nixon asking questions, making sure the plan will work, discussing how to handle the FBI agents. He's not a passive participant. He's actively engaged in the cover-up. This tape would later be called the smoking gun, and it was exactly that. Proof that Nixon knew about the cover-up less than a week after the crime. Proof that he actively participated in obstructing justice. Proof that every denial he made over the next 2 years, every press conference where he insisted he knew nothing, every speech about law and order, was a lie. The tape recorder kept rolling. Nixon had no idea it was there. He'd already forgotten about it. The voice-activated system was so seamless, so automatic, that he didn't think about it anymore, and in that moment of casual criminality, he sealed his fate. 3. The accidental confession, how one aide blew it wide open. For over a year, the Watergate investigation churned forward. Senate hearings gripped the nation. Newspaper leaks dripped out daily. The Washington Post's Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were running circles around the White House, feeding story after story to the public. Grand juries were convened. Indictments were handed down. And then in June 1973, John Dean testified. Dean was Nixon's White House counsel, the guy who was supposed to protect the president. Instead, he sat before the Senate Watergate Committee for 5 days and methodically described the cover-up. He testified that Nixon was directly involved, that there was a cancer on the presidency, that the president had discussed hush money payments to the burglars, that the whole thing went to the top. But it was Dean's word against Nixon's. The White House attacked Dean's credibility. They called him a liar, a disgruntled employee, someone trying to save himself by throwing the president under the bus. And without proof, it was a he said situation. So the American people didn't know who to believe until Friday, July 13th, 1973. That's when everything changed. That's when the bomb dropped. Alexander Butterfield was a mid-level White House staffer, the guy who managed paper flow to the president. He'd been subpoenaed to testify before the Senate Watergate Committee. He wasn't a big name. He wasn't expected to say anything dramatic. The staff interviewed him in a background session on Friday afternoon. They asked him routine questions about White House procedures. And then Donald Sanders, a Republican minority counsel, asked the question that changed history. Was there any other kind of taping system in the president's office? Butterfield later said he was hoping no one would ask. He'd seen John Dean's testimony mentioning oddly specific quotes from private meetings with Nixon. He'd noticed the committee seemed curious about how Dean could remember such details. But nobody had asked the direct question. Until now, Butterfield had already decided that if asked directly, he would tell the truth. He couldn't lie under oath. So he said it. I was wondering if someone would ask that. There is tape in the Oval Office. The staffers in the room froze. They knew immediately what this meant. Everything Nixon had said to his aides, every planning session, every conversation about the cover-up, it was all on tape. The smoking gun wasn't hypothetical. It existed. It was sitting in a safe somewhere in the White House. And suddenly, John Dean's testimony looked a lot more credible. Scott Armstrong and Eugene Boyce, the Democratic staffers present, rushed to tell Sam Dash, the committee's chief counsel. Donald Sanders ran to find Fred Thompson, the Republican counsel. Everyone recognized the significance. As one participant later said, Watergate was transformed. 3 days later, on July 16th, Butterfield repeated his testimony in public, before live television cameras. Fred Thompson asked him about the tapes. Butterfield calmly explained the whole system, when it was installed, how it worked, where the microphones were hidden. The American people watched, stunned. The president had been secretly recording everything, and now, the whole world knew. Butterfield paid a brutal price for his honesty. Within weeks, he was forced out of his job as head of the Federal Aviation Administration. He couldn't find work for 2 years. Many of his friends, loyal Nixon people, considered him a traitor. He was persona non grata in Republican circles. But years later, in an interview, he would say he saw his colleagues, good men he liked and admired, going off to jail to protect Nixon's lies. And he realized Nixon had exploited their loyalty, used them, sacrificed them to save himself. Butterfield's revelation transformed Watergate from a political scandal into a constitutional crisis. It was no longer a he said story. The truth was sitting on magnetic tape, thousands of hours of it. The only question was whether anyone would ever get to hear it. We're just getting warmed up. In the next section, we're going to look at the Saturday Night Massacre and how Nixon's desperation to hide the tapes backfired spectacularly. If you want to understand how power actually works in Washington and why checking it matters, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It helps the algorithm. And unlike Richard Nixon, I won't secretly record you. Also, drop a comment. If you were on the Supreme Court in 1974, would you have forced Nixon to turn over the tapes? I read every comment. 4. The Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon fired everyone. The moment the tapes became public knowledge, Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox wanted them. Cox was a Harvard law professor, a former Solicitor General under JFK, a man known for his integrity, his legal brilliance, and his absolute refusal to be intimidated. He was, in the words of Attorney General Elliot Richardson, someone who would just as soon cut off his right arm as do anything improper or partisan. On July 23, 1973, Cox's office subpoenaed 9 of the tapes for use in the criminal investigation. Nixon refused to comply. He claimed executive privilege, the idea that a president's private conversations are protected from the courts, that forcing him to turn over the tapes would violate the separation of powers. The courts disagreed. On October 12, 1973, the U.S. Court of Appeals ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes. The ruling was clear. Executive privilege does not extend to criminal investigations. Nixon panicked. He couldn't turn over the tapes. The June 23rd smoking gun conversation was on there. The evidence of his involvement in the cover-up was sitting on those reels. So he offered a compromise. Senator John Stennis, a 71-year-old Democrat from Mississippi, who was hard of hearing and recovering from recent gunshot wounds from a burglary attempt, would listen to the tapes and provide summaries to Cox's office. Cox would get no actual recordings, just Stennis's version of what was said. It was absurd. Stennis was on heavy medication. He had trouble hearing, and the plan was to take him to Camp David, where Nixon loyalist J. Fred Buzzhart would assist him in verifying the transcripts. In other words, Nixon's lawyer would help decide what was relevant. The whole thing reeked of a setup. Cox held a press conference on Friday afternoon, October 19th, and rejected the deal. There were fewer football games on TV than usual that day, and more people than expected tuned in to watch. They saw a mild-mannered law professor calmly explaining why summaries weren't good enough, why the integrity of the investigation required the actual evidence. He didn't grandstand. He didn't attack the president. He just explained the law, the Constitution, and why he couldn't accept the compromise. The American people watched, and they connected with it. Here was a man standing up to the President of the United States, not out of political ambition, but out of principle. The next day, Saturday, October 20th, Nixon decided to fire Cox. He ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to do it. Richardson refused and resigned in protest. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork, now the acting Attorney General, carried out the order. Cox was fired. FBI agents were dispatched to seal his offices, and the offices of Richardson and Ruckelshaus, as if they were crime scenes. The press dubbed it the Saturday Night Massacre. And it backfired spectacularly. Within hours, the American people erupted. Over 50,000 telegrams poured into Congress in the next few days. Western Union was swamped. Phone lines were jammed. The message was clear and overwhelming. Impeach Nixon. For the first time, polls showed a majority of Americans wanted the president removed from office. Members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, started drafting articles of impeachment. Nixon had thought he could bury the investigation by firing Cox. Instead, he'd created a constitutional crisis. He'd shown the world that he was willing to destroy anyone who got too close to the truth. And rather than intimidating his enemies, he'd energized them. Within weeks, facing overwhelming pressure, Nixon was forced to appoint a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. And Jaworski picked up right where Cox left off. He wanted the tapes. All of them. All of them. The Saturday Night Massacre hadn't killed the investigation. It had made it unstoppable. 5. United States vs. Nixon. The unanimous smackdown. In April 1974, Leon Jaworski obtained a subpoena ordering Nixon to release 64 tapes and papers related to specific meetings between the president and those indicted by the grand jury. Nixon stalled. He released edited transcripts of 43 conversations. He claimed they were close enough. They weren't. The transcripts were sanitized. Profanity was replaced with expletive deleted. Gaps were unexplained. Crucial passages were missing. And critically, they weren't evidence. They were just Nixon's version of events, typed up by Nixon's people, with Nixon's edits. District Court Judge John Sirica wasn't buying it. He ordered Nixon to produce the actual tapes. Nixon appealed, and Jaworski, recognizing the urgency, appealed directly to the Supreme Court, bypassing the normal appeals process. The court agreed to hear the case on an expedited basis. This was it. What? The showdown. United States vs. Nixon. The case that would determine whether the president was above the law. The case was argued on July 8, 1974. Nixon's lawyers, led by James St. Clair, made an extraordinary argument. They claimed the president had absolute executive privilege, that he was, in St. Clair's own words, as powerful a monarch as Louis XIV, only 4 years at a time, that the courts had no authority to review a presidential claim of privilege, that Nixon, and Nixon alone, could decide what evidence would be released. Jaworski argued that no one is above the law, that executive privilege doesn't include the right to cover up crimes, that the Sixth Amendment guarantee of a fair trial for the indicted men required the evidence, that the need for justice outweighed the president's desire for confidentiality. On July 24, 1974, less than 3 weeks after oral arguments, the Supreme Court issued its decision, 8-0. Unanimous. Unanimous. A. Justice William Rehnquist recused himself because he'd worked in the Nixon administration, but the other 8 justices, including 3 Nixon appointees, ruled against the president. Chief Justice Warren Burger, himself a Nixon appointee, wrote the opinion. The message was crystal clear. The court acknowledged that executive privilege exists, that presidents need confidentiality to get candid advice. But that privilege is not absolute. It cannot be used to obstruct justice. It cannot be used to hide evidence in a criminal trial. The needs of the judicial system, the need for truth, outweigh the generalized interest in confidentiality. Neither the doctrine of separation of powers, nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications, without more, can sustain an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. Translation: turn over the tapes, Mr. President. You're not a king. You're not above the law. The Constitution doesn't grant you immunity from the judicial process. You have to comply with a valid subpoena like everyone else. It's hard to overstate how important this decision was. The court could have ducked. They could have issued a narrow ruling. They could have split along ideological lines and given Nixon something to work with. Instead, they issued a unanimous opinion that reinforced the bedrock principle of American democracy. No one, not even the president, is above the law. Within hours, the White House announced it would comply. There was speculation about whether Nixon would defy the court, whether he would claim the military would support him, whether he would trigger a full constitutional crisis, but he didn't. And that he lost, and he knew it. And he knew it. The tapes would be released. 6. August 5, 1974, the day the smoking gun fired. On August 5, 1974, the White House released the transcripts of the subpoenaed tapes, and among them was the smoking gun. The June 23, 1972 conversation between Nixon and Haldeman, the one where they discussed using the CIA to shut down the FBI investigation, the one that proved Nixon had been lying for over 2 years. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The 11 Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee who had voted against impeachment said they would now change their votes. Nixon's remaining defenders in Congress melted away. Senators Barry Goldwater and Hugh Scott did a head count and estimated that fewer than 15 senators would vote to acquit Nixon in an impeachment trial. He needed 34 to avoid removal. He had maybe 10. Maybe. Nixon had spent 2 years insisting he knew nothing about the cover-up, that he was shocked by the revelations, that he would get to the bottom of it, that he was as interested in the truth as anyone. The tape showed he was lying from day 6. He wasn't a victim of rogue staffers. He wasn't out of the loop. He was the architect. He ordered the cover-up. He personally approved using the CIA to obstruct the FBI. And he lied about it for 784 days. Even his own staff turned on him. Chief of Staff Alexander Haig told him privately that he had to resign. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who'd stood by Nixon through everything, said the same thing. On August 6th, Nixon's congressional liaison, Bill Timmons, gave him the final tally. Only 7 senators still supported him. 7. The next day, August 7th, the 3 top Republican leaders in Congress came to the White House. Barry Goldwater, the conservative icon, the 1964 presidential nominee. Hugh Scott, the Senate Minority Leader from Pennsylvania. John Rhodes, the House Minority Leader from Arizona. These weren't Nixon's enemies. These were his people. Republicans. Conservatives. And they came to tell him it was over. They met in the Oval Office around 5 p.m. Goldwater told Nixon the truth. The case was hopeless. There weren't enough votes to save him. Impeachment in the House was certain. Conviction in the Senate was inevitable. It was time to go. Nixon was alternately emotional and stoic. He talked about how Lenin and Gandhi had written great works from prison. He was processing the reality that his presidency was over, that he would be the first president in American history to resign, that his name would be synonymous with political scandal forever. The next night, August 8, 1974, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Nixon addressed the nation. Sitting in the Oval Office, the same room where he'd recorded the conversations that destroyed him, he announced his resignation effective the next day at noon. He admitted to bad judgments but not to serious wrongdoing. He said he no longer had the political support to govern effectively. He said he was resigning for the good of the country, to help heal the nation. He didn't say the truth. That he'd lied, and that he'd obstructed justice from day 6, that he'd ordered the CIA to interfere with the FBI, that he'd betrayed his oath of office, that he'd abused the power of the presidency to cover up a crime, and that he'd been caught because he was paranoid enough to record every word of his own criminality. The next morning, Nixon said goodbye to his staff in an emotional speech. Then he walked to the helicopter on the South Lawn, turned, and gave his famous 2-handed wave. And he was gone. The first and only president to resign from office. brought down by his own tapes. 7. The 18-minute gap, the cover-up after the cover-up. Here's the thing about the Watergate tapes. They weren't all there. On November 7, 1973, during the initial review of the tapes for the court, a shocking discovery was made. An 18.5-minute gap in a crucial conversation from June 20, 1972, just 3 days after the break-in. The conversation was between Nixon and Haldeman, and right in the middle of it, the tape just stops. Buzz. Static. Then it starts again, 18 minutes later. Nixon's personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, said she accidentally erased it. She was transcribing the tape, the phone rang, she answered it, and while reaching to stop the machine, she accidentally hit the record button instead, and she kept her foot on the pedal for the entire phone call. 5 minutes, she said. Just 5 minutes. But forensic analysis told a different story. The gap wasn't created in one continuous erasure. It was done in at least 5 separate segments, possibly as many as 9. Someone sat there and deliberately, methodically, erased that tape in multiple sessions. This wasn't an accident. This was destruction of evidence. We'll never know what was on it. Some historians believe it was Nixon and Haldeman discussing the immediate response to the break-in, possibly planning the cover-up from day one. Others think it contained something even worse, some revelation so damaging that it had to be destroyed even at the cost of obvious obstruction. Alexander Haig later speculated that Nixon himself may have erased it, fumbling with the equipment in his characteristically inept way, then panicking when he realized what he'd done. The gap became its own mini-scandal. A cover-up within the cover-up. Nixon had created a recording system to control history. Then he or someone close to him destroyed part of it. The irony is thick enough to choke on. He recorded himself to protect himself. Then he destroyed the recording to protect himself. And the destruction only made him look more guilty. The 18.5-minute gap remains one of the great mysteries of Watergate. What did Nixon say in those missing minutes? What was so damaging that it had to be erased? We'll never know. The gap is a black hole in the historical record. A permanent question mark, and a reminder that even with 3,700 hours of tape, we still don't know everything. 8. The lessons nobody learned, why it could happen again. Watergate was supposed to be the moment America learned its lesson. That's what everyone said at the time. The system worked. The courts held firm. The press did its job. Congress checked the executive. And a president who broke the law was forced from office. Democracy had survived its greatest test since the Civil War. But here's the uncomfortable truth. But Nixon almost got away with it. If Alexander Butterfield had lied when asked about the tapes, if the Supreme Court had split 5-3 instead of ruling 8-0, if Republican senators had valued party loyalty over the Constitution, if any of those dominoes had fallen differently, Nixon would have served out his term. He would have destroyed the evidence. He would have stonewalled the investigators. And history would remember Watergate as a minor scandal that got blown out of proportion by a hostile media. The system didn't work automatically. It worked because individuals at crucial moments chose integrity over self-interest. Butterfield told the truth even though it cost him his career and his friends. Elliot Richardson and William Ruckelshaus resigned rather than fire Archibald Cox, even though obeying the president would have been easier and more lucrative. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously, even though some justices owed their seats to Nixon and could have found a way to help him. Barry Goldwater told Nixon the truth, even though they were in the same party, and Goldwater had defended Nixon for years. These weren't structural safeguards. These were people making hard choices. People who could have bent, who could have looked the other way, who could have rationalized and compromised. But they didn't. They stood firm, and that's what saved the Republic. Today, American politics is more polarized than it was in 1974. The media landscape is fragmented into partisan echo chambers. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. The Supreme Court is seen as political. Congress is dysfunctional. The presidency is more powerful than ever. The question is, if a president committed similar abuses today, would enough people across party lines stand up? Or would they rationalize, deflect, and defend? Would party loyalty trump constitutional duty? Would the base demand protection for their guy, regardless of the evidence? The scary answer is, we don't know. The institutions that checked Nixon in 1974 exist on paper. But institutions are only as strong as the people who operate them. And if those people value winning over truth, Power over principle, their team over their country, the whole thing falls apart. Watergate isn't just history. It's a warning flare. It's a reminder that democracy is fragile, that it requires constant vigilance, that it can be undermined from within, and that the only thing standing between a free society and an authoritarian one is people willing to say no when the powerful demand yes. Final thoughts. So what's the takeaway from the Watergate tapes? It's not that Richard Nixon was uniquely evil. He wasn't. Plenty of presidents have lied, covered up mistakes, pushed ethical boundaries. Nixon just got caught in a particularly spectacular way. The real lesson is that power corrupts, and unchecked power corrupts absolutely. Nixon had the ability to order the CIA to shut down an FBI investigation, and he did it. He had the ability to fire prosecutors who got too close, and he tried. He had the ability to claim he was above the law, and he believed it. The only thing that stopped him was a system of checks and balances, operated by people who refused to bend. And the ultimate irony? The thing that brought him down wasn't his enemies. It wasn't the Washington Post. It wasn't the Democrats in Congress. It wasn't even the special prosecutor. It was his own paranoia, his own compulsion to record everything, his own inability to trust anyone, including himself. Nixon bugged himself. He created the evidence, but he preserved it. He kept it safe in a vault in the White House, and when the courts ordered him to hand it over, he lost everything. His presidency, his reputation, his place in history. There's a lesson there. For politicians, sure, but also for anyone who thinks they're smarter than the system, that they can lie their way out of anything. That power protects them from consequences. It doesn't. Not forever. The tape keeps rolling. And eventually, someone will press play. The Watergate tapes destroyed Richard Nixon, but they also gave us something valuable. A complete record of how power corrupts, how lies compound, how cover-ups spiral out of control, and how in the end the truth has a way of coming out, even when the most powerful man in the world tries to bury it. If you want to understand another moment when American democracy hung by a thread, check out our upcoming video on the constitutional crisis of 1876, when the presidential election was literally stolen and nobody went to jail. And if you learnt something today, if this shattered any illusions about how fragile our institutions really are, hit that like button. It helps more than executive privilege. See you in the next one.